All right, well, welcome to Psycho Bible, battling about psychology and theology, and I am super excited, just beyond thrilled. This is my first ever interview where I'm conducting an interview. I've been interviewed a few times, but I'm excited to be conducting my first interview with two people that I highly admire and deeply respect. We have, and I'll let you guys do a quick introduction for yourselves, but I just want to say I'm just so just proud and feel so privileged to call you guys mentors and colleagues. And so I'm here today with Dr. Joseph Nicolosi Jr. and Dr. Carolyn Pela. So how about we start with Carolyn? If you could just share a little brief intro, who you are, what you do.
Sure. Well, I'm serving mostly in academia right now. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist, been doing that for a really long time. I won't even say. But I'm an assistant dean at Arizona Christian University in Phoenix. That's mostly what I do.
Also, you're one of the past presidents of the Alliance for Therapeutic Choice and Scientific Integrity. So that also indicates some of the work you've done. It's not exclusively the work you've done, but you've done some work with individuals dealing with unwanted same-sex attraction or same-sex attraction experiences.
Right, that's definitely one of my specializations, that and several other specializations, but working with usually women and families, adolescents and their families, where same-sex attraction is an issue. I've done a lot of work around that.
Even though we're not going to really get into this, I just want to point out something that Carolyn, or Dr. Pela rather, she uses a narrative therapy approach, which most people aren't aware. You can use more than what people hear of some of the approaches we're going to talk about. There's all sorts of therapeutic approaches you can use to address this concern that clients may come in with. And it's really fascinating that you use narrative therapy because you're speaking the language that the culture is using these days. I see some of the terms you like centering, and it's all the popular terms. Like you're comfortable with that language that is being used so much by the opposition to our work. And so it's like you have the opportunity to turn it like on the head and show that that same framework can be used to support individuals who are coming for help with these issues.
Right. Yeah, I love the narrative therapy underlying philosophy of privileging the client's autonomy, privileging self-determination, privileging their values. That's at the heart of narrative therapy. Centering their values over the therapist's values, and collaborating with them to allow them to rewrite their story, or I always think about it, reclaim their stories, because so much of the cultural narrative for this population in particular, the cultural narrative has tried to erase them, erase their experiences, erase their values, erase them. And so we have to peel that away, the cultural dominant narrative, and allow them to find their own story again. And it's really a lot of fun to use that approach. But it's funny. I'm glad you're bringing that up, because one of the things that Joe Nicolosi Sr. and I used to talk about a lot is that good therapy is good therapy. It's not about, it's not like this particular presenting problem is so unique and so bizarre that you have to, now of course we'll find things that work really well with this population because of the trauma background and all of that. But good therapy is good therapy.
Yeah. And what you said, we're going to get into that later as well, is the importance of those very things you named. All right, but before we forget, let's get to Dr. Joseph Nicolosi Jr. here. Could you just share a little bit about yourself for the audience?
I'm a licensed clinical psychologist. I'm here just north of LA at the Breakthrough Clinic. And this is what we do. We treat traumatic memories, and we're open to sexuality changing and willing to ask questions and move in directions that some might find controversial, but we'd rather be scientifically correct than politically correct.
Yeah. And you're also the founder of the Reintegrative Therapy Association, which we're definitely going to be getting to some of the things you've been experiencing with that. But first, I want to just find some terms, because I've been looking forward to doing this interview for quite a while, and then it just happens to be perfect timing because of some of the things that are going on in the news right now. We're talking about Bill C4 that just passed in Canada, banning what they call conversion therapy. The UK is talking about banning conversion practices. And France just passed a so-called conversion therapy ban. And beyond all that, for the past 10 years, we've been dealing with one ban after another, starting with one for minors in California, right where you're at, Dr. Nicolosi. So we have the media and the educational institutions been really controlling the narrative and defining the terms. So let's just first get some of these terminology out of the way, because people are going to hear us talk about this and they're going to think, oh, they're talking about conversion therapy. So, and I know we hate that term. And why is that? When people use the term conversion therapy, what do they mean? What would you say when you hear conversion therapy? What do you think that people are talking about when they say
I don't know. That's I always ask them, what's conversion therapy?
Yep.
That's always how I respond to it, because I really don't know what conversion therapy is. I remember the first time someone asked me when they found out that I, was in the practice of honoring people's values and their self-determination around their sexuality. And they asked me, oh, do you do conversion therapy? I'm like, what is that? I literally never had heard of it. This was decades ago, but I still don't know what it is.
Yeah. And Dr. Nicolosi, conversion therapy, what is the understanding that you come across?
The term conversion therapy is broad, ill-defined. There's no ethics code, no governing body. It could be practiced by somebody who's unlicensed. It's an infinitely malleable term with no meaning. I prefer to stick with the scientific terms. And what Dr. Pela did in her study, we examined reintegrative therapy. It's part of the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. It's a registered term. It's a very specific protocol published in the Journal of Human Sexuality. It treats traumatic memories. Sexuality change is the byproduct, not the goal. And that's one of many distinguishing characteristics. There are 12 or 13 distinctions between so-called conversion therapy and reintegrative therapy, and they're all listed on reintegrativetherapy.com. Click on About Us, and you'll find them all there.
In 2012, when California passed their ban for therapy for minors, they used the term SOCE, and that's been floating around there as well. SOCE being sexual orientation change efforts. And let's just quickly define that. That's too broad as well, because that includes not just therapy, but also like support groups or self-help or pastoral counseling, religious mediation. And so at the Alliance for Therapeutic Choice and Scientific Integrity, we don't even prefer to use SOCE. We prefer another term, safety. So Carolyn, could you define safety and what that stands for?
Yeah, it's sexual attraction, fluidity, exploration, and therapy. So it's a very different concept than, in my opinion, sexual orientation change efforts. First of all, sexual orientation change efforts assume that sexual orientation exists, and there's very little evidence to show that people are born with sexual erotic attractions of any kind. And so, and we could go on and on about that, but I just prefer the idea. And again, it's congruent with my practice that it's an exploration process. It's led by the client. It's not efforts. I don't like that word. It's like, let's try to do this. It's like a beautiful exploration process of discovery. And when we support client autonomy and self-determination, the research on that shows that even just the process, as long as they're supported in that and put in the center, even regardless of where they end up in their fluidity exploration, their well-being is increased. Yeah. So
what I like too about safety is it's broad, and so that it includes all sorts of therapeutic models,
right?
But it's also very precise, so it's exclusive, so it only includes professional therapy approaches,
right?
It's not including these self-help approaches or people reading a book or going to a seminar or going to a pastor. Not that we are against people seeking religious approaches, but we want to narrow it down when we're talking about therapy, because most of the bans that we've been seeing over the past 10 years have been specifically for licensed therapists or psychologists. And so we need to show, well, if we just narrow it down to that, what are we talking about? What do we see? So it's broad. It includes multiple approaches, of which reintegrative therapy is one of the approaches, but not the only one. There's another term that gets conflated with conversion therapy, and that is reparative therapy. And I think it's helpful for us to quickly define that, what actual reparative therapy was. Joseph, could you briefly give us an explanation when, because of the fact that your father is the founder of legitimate reparative therapy, could you explain how that's different from conversion therapy?
I should have a more precise definition because I own the trademark for that term also. And even I don't remember off the top of my head the exact definition, but it's something akin to the ideas that my father put forth. And he was developing this idea over time, reparative drive theory, reparative therapy, in his book, Shame and Attachment Loss. That's probably where it is. That's probably the closest thing you'll find to a codex for that. But it was his ideas, his developmental theories based on the psychodynamic understandings, and using a lot of the psychodynamic framework at understanding the development of same-sex attractions as it pertains to men.
Yeah. And unfortunately, so many people have taken that term and they've misused it, misapplied it, so that anyone who is counseling anyone for unwanted same-sex attraction now calls himself a reparative therapist. And it just got to the point where it lost sight of what the meaning was. So 2017, you introduced the term reintegrative therapy. How would you define reintegrative therapy?
Reintegrative therapy has a more precise definition, and it's basically a trauma treatment. It can be used for anyone. In fact, there was a study that came out recently, several months ago, in the Journal of Psychology and Psychotherapy, which looked at the treatment of using the reintegrative protocol for the treatment of binge eating for men and women, and found significant reductions in the binge eating. It was a pilot study, but reintegrative protocol could be used for all sorts of things. It could be used for heterosexuals. Just as somebody with heterosexuality versus homosexuality, it's the same treatment. It's just a trauma model, and other changes are the byproduct. So the binge eaters and the individuals in Carolyn's or Dr. Pela's study, they got the exact same treatment. It's just treating traumatic memories. So what is one part of your life that you'd want to explore? I'm going to vastly oversimplify it, but take something that you want to explore in your life, some reaction that you're having, and imagine it, get into it, feel it really intensely, let yourself feel the feeling, and now imagine going outside yourself, looking in your own eyes, and with a patient guiding therapist in a self-directed manner, the client is usually able to look in and see different layers of emotions, and we keep going until the client is able to identify whatever emotion he or she sees as the deepest. Then the therapist will invite the client to look back at earlier times that person has felt that way. And then whenever memories that the client identifies as traumatic are mentioned, then the therapist reprocesses them with some evidence-based trauma method. And therapists use a variety of methods. That's it. And then you go back to the original stimulus and say, okay, what's your reaction to it now? And people notice, the binge eaters, anyway, they just notice significant decreases as a spontaneous byproduct.
Yep. And I'm happy to say, full disclosure, that I consult with you and being trained in reintegrative therapy. And I've seen it being helpful, not just with clients dealing with sexual attraction issues, but also with pornography addiction issues or just past trauma issues. I use this stuff without even telling people what some of the background of it is. And then later they're like, well, how can I learn about this more? And I tell them more. But it's just good therapy. It's really good at getting to the root issues of things and resolving that. So that's what it is. What's occurred over the past week that totally misconstrues what you do?
So we, our organization, the Reintegrative Therapy Association, released some videos on YouTube showing what this process looks like and talking about the published research. Generally, those videos were centering on Dr. Pela's research and her research findings. And after gaining a fairly large number of views, YouTube in the dead of night on one Friday night They shut down the entire channel. They suspended it. I had one appeal. I wrote to YouTube and said, look, we're a 501c3 nonprofit. We use the exact same treatment methods for males, female, heterosexual, homosexual, it doesn't matter. And all of the videos show treatment protocols that are evidence-based, published in peer-reviewed studies. That didn't matter to them. They shut down the entire channel permanently. They banned everything, all the information, all references to Dr. Pela's work. And that's what this is really about. It's big tech suppressing science about this issue, about sexual fluidity. And all references to Dr. Pela's work were just scrubbed from YouTube's record. And that's important because it really speaks to how big tech is shaping the public. They are picking and choosing what scientific information we're allowed to talk about. And in doing so, they're shaping public opinion and arguably possibly spreading medical misinformation, health misinformation to the public, giving people only partial views about what the peer-reviewed evidence actually shows. And that takes away rights and choices from the individual. Many people use YouTube to look up information, rightly or wrongly, but they use it for information about their own mental health. And so that deprives the public. I would even go so far as to say the people who are the most dispossessed in this regard are individuals who were sexually abused. 1/3 of my clients are men who were sexually abused. And they believe, and others are free to disagree, but they believe that those abuse memories had an impact on their sexuality. And they deserve the right to have access to treatment information. It's not just these individuals saying it. The American Psychological Association stated in their Handbook of Sexuality and Psychology, if anyone is really interested, I know people on this channel want to do a deep dive. It's in volume 1, page 610 to 620. They go through an analysis that linked childhood sexual abuse with subsequent male same-sex attractions. And that information was based upon, in part, a 30-year longitudinal study of documented sex abuse victims. So this is not some fringe theory that Dr. Pela is talking about. This is mainstream peer-reviewed evidence that's being scrubbed from the record, and anybody who has any interest in having a free intellectual discussion on this topic should be outraged.
Yeah. Now we can only speculate, but where do you think big tech, YouTube, was getting their information that what you're performing is something to be banning?
2 or 3 days before the ban, Forbes magazine published an article that specifically mentioned reintegrative therapy and saying these videos are, quote, misinformation. Now, YouTube called the videos hate speech in their personal email to me. Forbes called it misinformation. The Forbes article was basically copy and paste from another organization that's an offshoot of the Southern Poverty Law Center. So I suspect someone at the Southern Poverty Law Center saw the videos, saw how powerful Dr. Pela's work is, and decided that we need to call in a strike on this information because it's too dangerous. It undermines the prevailing cultural ethos on this topic. And so they called for a strike, and the videos were going to be banned, and that's it. And big tech took their marching orders. I mean, the Southern Poverty Law Center has nearly $500 million in funds. They're a very powerful legal group. And when they want something banned, apparently they get it banned.
Now, this group that's a subsidiary of the Southern Poverty Law Center, that's the Global Project Against Hate and Extremism. And that was the report that they published listing like a dozen different organizations or ministries, counseling centers that they deem hate groups, which included Reintegrative Therapy Association. I just did a video on it, my last video, about time to wake up and rise up. I addressed that right there. All these organizations like the Alliance for Therapeutic Choice, Restored Hope Network, different counselors I know were in that list. And so, yeah, it sure doesn't seem like it's a coincidence that a couple days after that was released, then YouTube goes straight for your channel. And think about what the content was too. Your content was simply demonstrations of the work you do, and just explaining the science behind it, explaining the process, showing that you're using mainstream approaches. This is not some bizarre, exotic techniques. We're not using holding therapies or rebirthing, or not using shaming or beating the Bible over people's heads or anything bizarre and actually non-therapeutic. and yet it's deemed unscientific misinformation, really indicates to me that they're really not actually looking at the research and not taking time to really look at it with any sort of good faith at all.
And that's why Dr. Pela's research is dangerous, because it's mainstream, it's well done, it's done under rigorous scientific procedures and standards, and that's why it's dangerous. It's because it's so good that they find it to be so dangerous.
Which actually is a perfect segue to the next topic here. And what have been the common attacks against safety? Dr. Pela, what some of the common attacks that we've heard and that your study sought to address?
So, it's all on misinformation. I mean, that any attacks, of course, in the literature, there are a whole group of people for decades who have been trying to really trying to block people's autonomy in seeking help when they have they're experiencing unwanted same-sex attraction, particularly, but anything that is any desire to explore their sexuality in these ways. And the research, and I'm going to research that has been done and has been used by professional organizations to actually create standards is qualitative, it's retrospective. Now, and qualitative means that it's not empirical data. There are no experimental designs. It's retrospective, which means it's asking people to look back on their experiences in not just therapy, and you brought that up earlier, Andrew, is like any kind of experiences that they've had, whether it's church or a support group or whatever. They look back and they talk about what that was like for them and how they feel about it. And most often they recruit participants for these studies by looking for people who say that they didn't like it. And then they call this evidence. And I always say this, my undergraduate research methods students would understand that this is not legitimate research. It's not, but this is what the APA guidelines have been built on. And I'm calling out the APA here because they've literally built guidelines based on research that's not about therapy and research that's not empirical.
Yeah. I think I'm mostly referring to the Schindler and Schroeder study.
Schindler and Schroeder, and most lately Blosnick has been influential with the APA. 80% of those participants in that study did not receive psychotherapy, but they're using it as a standard to influence standards of psychotherapy. Yeah,
which we can do. I want to do at some point a whole video just on what we learned when we reanalyze the data from the Blosnick study, and even Schindler and Schroeder study. Even that one, as critical as they came with the original recruitment strategy and their bias that they obviously had, their study actually shows evidence of the therapy helping, or whatever counseling helping, and actually reducing suicidality. But yet that's the main study that the APA used in their 2009 task force report to say that SOCE is dangerous.
Right.
So, the irony. But
yeah.
The two main criticisms I want to point out, and that really your study addresses, are that safety, therapy used to explore sexuality attraction or sexual attraction fluidity is harmful, and that it doesn't help, that it's not effective. It doesn't actually achieve its goal.
Yeah.
So those are the two main criticisms we've had, that it's harmful and ineffective.
Yeah, those are the claims. Yeah, those are the claims.
Yeah, that's
from that research. That research is seeking to provide evidence for that, but it's not designed to provide evidence for that. Yeah. So,
and all the past studies have been retrospective, so we've had no prospective studies that measure anything prior to someone beginning treatment and then afterwards to see, well, that's what an experiment actually does, is to really rule out other variables and see, did this intervention do what it claims it's supposed to do. And
Right.
did it cause any harm or lack of benefit at least?
Right.
So we've had no actually prospective studies done. At the same time, we've had retrospective studies that report harm or lack of benefit, and as well as some retrospective studies that report benefit. So
Right.
it's kind of like they cancel each other out.
Right. Right.
So
Right.
you want to do a study that really answered these questions a little more definitively, no matter what the answer would be.
Right.
Correct?
Absolutely. Right. Yeah. And APA rightly criticized, or not, actually said, well, there's not really good, strong empirical research on this. So their solution was to not do it then, and don't do any research, because after all, there's no research to show that it's safe. So we can't do it to do the research. I mean, it's been really amazing. And we decided, no, actually, we need to find out, we need to provide evidence. So this study was the first prospective research on this, the first prospective and empirically designed study of this type anyway, but the first prospective one, where we measured people all the way along before they started therapy and then on through and we measured, as you were talking about, their well-being. How did it help them or harm them, and then was it effective? Did people actually have some experiences of sexual attraction fluidity?
And I really want to hammer that point home, that the 2009 task force report from the APA admitted that there are no studies of sufficient rigor to tell us whether or not modern versions of SOCE are beneficial or harmful or effective or not effective.
Right.
And yet that 2009 task force report has been used over the past 10 years to justify all the therapy bans that we've been seeing.
Right.
And so the therapy bans we've been seeing have been based on very shallow research. And the main argument we've been hearing is all major medical institutions or associations or organizations condemn reparative therapy or conversion therapy or SOCE, but they don't ever actually quote the research done that definitively argues that case.
Right.
So how far back are we going? When did you get this idea to do a study to answer these questions?
Oh, gosh, I don't know. Time flies when you're having fun. It started off, what happened is Dr. Phil Sutton, who is my co-author for this article, and I had designed a study to do just looking at well-being. And that study didn't, it was too grandiose, to tell you the truth. Our design, our protocol, all of the procedures were great, but we didn't have enough support on the ground to get that done. And so we attempted it, but we couldn't get enough data. Meanwhile, Dr. Joe Nicolosi Sr., a colleague of ours, said, hey, why don't you and I, think about something. So he invited me into gathering data at his clinic, the Thomas Aquinas Psychological Clinic, and with new clients, new patients coming in for therapy, and getting a baseline and going forward. So I think, gosh, I don't know when we started that. It was a long time ago.
Well, I remember I went to the Alliance conference in 2016. And Dr. Nicolosi Sr. presented the current standings or findings from that study. I think you guys were at the halfway point, because this was going to be a longitudinal study.
Yeah.
So I think you're about halfway through in 2016.
Maybe, because we were gathering data for 5 years. So where that halfway point was, it could have been halfway at that point.
So this is really helpful to know that this was a 5-year study, and we are dealing with brand new clients. These were not existing clients people coming in. We're going to really find out from the get-go what their levels of well-being are, and their levels of attraction and sexual identity or self-concept and behavior, all of that from the start, and then measure it along the way. What were some of the measurements used?
Yeah, so we use the OQ45.2 to measure well-being, and it's a great instrument that's been used for decades. It's translated into multiple languages, high validity, reliability, been standardized well, and it's 45 questions that measures people's distress level, basically their psychological, interpersonal, their social relationships, all of that stuff. So, it does a nice snapshot. And the purpose of the instrument originally was to assist therapists on monitoring their clients' well-being on a week-by-week, session-by-session basis. So it's ideal for us to be able to track people and be able to look at the well-being of them all along the way. And it's really a great instrument to use, just in terms of good practice, to make sure that what you're doing is helping your client. And it's very, very good at detecting change in a very short period of time. So it's wonderful. We use the first and the last measure of that as what is recommended by the publishers of the instrument for research purposes. So we used the baseline before they started therapy, and then their last measure, and compared those
And
scores.
Dr. Nicolosi, what were the measures used, or the instruments used to measure the sexuality elements?
The measurement that was used was the SAQ by Santero, sexual assessment questionnaire, and that looked at thoughts, feelings, behavior, and identity. It specified all of them to give a more comprehensive approach. So they wanted to make sure that it wasn't just behavior modification, because people can achieve behavior modification. You can do a behavioral thing and you can just change, but is it comprehensive? We don't know what an orientation is, as Dr. Pela mentioned earlier. The word orientation, a few problems. One is the term itself assumes that it's a stable construct that we're measuring. It's not necessarily a stable construct for all people. Number two is the term orientation is non-quantifiable. So if a person is 51% heterosexual, 49% homosexual, are they homosexual, heterosexual, or a bisexual? What if they're 75% heterosexual, 25% homosexual? At that point, are they heterosexual? Are they still bisexual? Are they homosexual? So if a term is not a stable construct, and if it's non-quantifiable, it's therefore unverifiable. It's an untestable hypothesis. So rather than creating an artificial, arbitrary construct, the components of sexuality were broken down into thoughts, feeling, behavior, identity, and then tracked in a more comprehensive way. And so that's what the SAQ was attempting to do.
Yes. And Dr. Pela, what can you tell us about the sample that we acquired?
So the participants you're
Yeah.
asking? Yeah. So there were 75 adult men, ages 18 to, I think, maybe somebody in their 70s. And mostly the average male was 18 to 34 years old. The group we had about 25% what I would consider very religious, because they attended worship, whether it was church, temple, about more than once a week. And then 25% didn't attend. So we had 25% who were either, we even had people who said they were atheists in the group. And then we had kind of people in between. So in terms of the religiosity, they're probably more religious than most people.
So 25% non-religious, that's quite significant.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, they, at least in terms of measuring religiosity by their involvement in a worship community, or a religious community. So
that goes against the narrative a bit there, that it's only people who are ashamed because of their religion or strict parents. So that brings us to the next question.
What can you tell me about
the motivations for these individuals?
Yeah. So there were only 3% who said that they were seeking exploration opportunities because it was a suggestion by their parents. And of course, these are adults. So, and then about 7% said they were doing it for social reasons. And we don't know the details of that. The remainder were doing it because they were essentially seeking congruence and seeking a value congruence and seeking an opportunity to pursue the lifestyle that they wanted, which some of them identified that they wanted to be married to a female. They wanted to they wanted to have children. And some of them said that they wanted to be living according to their internal values. So those are the main reasons, and most of them were one or the other, or a mix of all of those kinds of things. And again, it's a value congruence.
Yeah. Now, what were the procedures? Because this is a 5-year study, but were they required to do a certain number of sessions? Was there a certain protocol? What was the treatment like? And maybe Dr. Nicolosi, you could speak to that.
Yeah, I want to go back to something you said earlier. You were talking about the participants and the participants' motivations. I was talking yesterday with a reporter from the National Catholic Register who's interested in doing a study on this. That's doing a story on this. I'm so used to talking about studies. Doing a story on this. And the reporter said, now this study, meaning Dr. Pela's study, this study was about men with unwanted homosexuality. It's like, no, they were individuals that were open to their sexuality changing. Some of those individuals at some point in the therapy said, you know what, I want a gay identity. Okay, they were left in the study. They were not excluded from the study. So this was actually a study about sexual attraction, fluidity, exploration. And that's a big misnomer. There will be those who will attempt to attack Dr. Pela's work, but it was, and you can find it in her paper, it's people who are exploring sexual attraction fluidity. They were not rejected from the study if they chose to have a gay identity. Now, if they were, would we have seen more significant changes in sexuality in pre versus post? Possibly. But this is what makes Dr. Pela's work different from, say, Jones and Yarhouse and some of these other larger, more robust studies. The Spitzer study was about people who were motivated. They were highly motivated. They were religious. Mm-hmm. Okay, so Dr. Pela's work is really kind of a different category of work. It's people who are open to exploring it and just seeing what happens when they receive trauma treatment.
Here's something else that's really different about this. We were flies on the wall. So this isn't like your normal laboratory study. We were just coming in and observing what's happening to real people in these real clinics, everyday life, which again, the validity and the generalizability of our findings is increased because of that part of the design. So I just wanted to throw that in there because these folks were people who were just going to therapy. We didn't require a certain number of sessions. Their therapy just went as their therapy went, and we just
very natural
observed.
Process.
Exactly.
So this makes it what we call a quasi-experimental study.
Yes.
And can you just give that a quick definition? Because I think some lay people are going to hear it and think, so it wasn't really an experiment, because they're thinking, no, the gold standard is an experiment. You put them in a lab, you get rid of all other possible variables, and they only do this, and you have like a control group. Can you explain how beneficial it was to do this sort of study the way you did it?
Yeah. So it's a single group design. So that's what makes it quasi-experimental. We didn't assign some people to a control group or some people to a different treatment. Like we could have assigned, for example, we could have had some people just go to support group, non-therapeutic, just give them something, because these people were distressed.
Yeah.
They're distressed, and so we're like, let's don't do that. We decided we didn't want to to do a control group or a weight group or whatever, and we just wanted to do a single, again, making this as natural as we could as part of the setting. Yeah. But here's an interesting thing that a lot of people, in terms of research design, because we were measuring two different variables, well-being and sexual attraction fluidity, and they're not related to one another. And what we find when you're doing a single group design, that's a good idea to do that, because you're increasing, if there is some change in both of those variables, then it's likely it was the intervention that did it, because there's two different variables that are changing after that are unrelated to one another after the intervention, and so increases what we call the internal validity. And so that's a pretty cool thing about this study, and how it was designed, and and how unusual it is actually.
Yeah, very important point. All right, now partway through the whole study, Joe Nicolosi Sr. passed away. That was March 2017, right? Now, the study was still undergoing at that point. Those clients then transferred over to your practice, Breakthrough Clinic, correct, Joe?
Mm-hmm.
What I'm curious, that was a great loss for the whole community and for the whole world. It's tragic. How did that impact the treatment? I've always been curious about that, because you have these clients there, you develop this therapeutic relationship, because I imagine he was seeing a number of the clients personally, not just being the director of the practice, but he was actually personally seeing a bunch of these clients. Did that impact treatment in any way?
I don't know that it impacted the treatment protocol in any way. On a quantifiable research method level, it'd probably be fairly seamless. But on a qualitative person-to-person level, yeah, I think so. Many of these men had really formed a bond. I mean, people form bonds with their therapists, and that was really painful. It was really painful for them. There are ways that would be difficult to measure. I know, because I know on a felt level that it was very painful for them. But I don't know that it would change much in terms of the design. That's the importance of using treatment protocols. So on a purely scientific level, on a procedural level, I don't know that it had a very significant impact.
Okay.
But on a personal level, yeah, I'm sure it resonated and was extremely powerful. Something that Dr. Pela mentioned is that many, though certainly not all, of these individuals were people of faith. They may not have been Christian, some of them were Jewish or Muslim, or they would talk about how values were important to them. And I'm sure that helped them through this time.
Yeah. So I wanted to actually highlight that, because when we get to the results, I want people to keep that in mind, that here are these individuals who experience a major obstacle in the treatment process, but look at the results still. So, but we're going to get to that in a little bit. Before we talk about the results, Dr. Pela, in your actual study, the actual paper, you have a literature review that gets into some important points there. So before we get into the results, like, okay, the potential for harm from this type of therapy and the chances of effectiveness, one of the things you did in your literature review was talk about the potential for harm in therapy in general, and how effective therapy in general is. And that sort of gives us a context. When we talk about, SOCE or safety is harmful, well, compared to what? Is therapy itself harmful? So could you provide a little bit of the data there that was in your literature review regarding the risks within therapy in general?
Right. Yeah. So this has been a suggestion. Actually, it was in a paper that Dr. Christopher Rossick had written, where he said, we can't talk about harm in this kind of therapy for this particular population with these particular goals if we don't do it in the context of what you're saying, harm in general in psychotherapy. And there's been quite a bit of research done on that, even though people don't like to talk about it. But probably 6 to 10% of people fall within that. It depends on the study, but generally that's a good range. 6 to 10% of people going to therapy experience harm to one degree or another. It can be more just like, it's just not effective. It doesn't really help. It's just a waste of time, to actually feeling some trauma as a result. I just talked to somebody last week that had experienced trauma, like actually had to go to therapy with someone else after having therapy with a gay affirmative therapist. But that's a whole different story. And so it happens in regardless of the approach. And, there's all kinds of research about why that happens and what sets you up for success as a therapist of not being harmful. Yeah. And really one of the key things, and I had to cut this out of my lit review to make it shorter, but there's this whole body of literature that demonstrates that promotion of self-determination and autonomy of the client is the best way to protect them from harm.
Yeah, I want to get into that because you brought up in the conference, the digital conference or the online conference we did. You did get into that for a bit, but let me just get it back to the risks in therapy in general. Some of the things I remember from when you were presenting your study at the conference was that about 45% of clients coming to therapy for depression experienced no change, like no real benefit. Like if this was widely known that nearly half of the clients coming to counseling for depression will receive no benefit from it, we would probably be storming all the therapist's office and saying you're a bunch of frauds and crooks and swindlers here.
Or we should ban people from seeking help for their depression. We shouldn't allow people to seek help for depression. And then we should have laws against that.
Yeah, if we're going to be consistent here, why don't we just ban therapy as a practice in general? It's all a bunch of quackery.
Right.
3 to 10% of clients for therapy in general, for other non-same-sex attraction issues, experience clinical deterioration. So not just no benefit, but actually get worse. So that's just in therapy in general. So when we talk about the potential of harm for safety, we have to put it in terms of that light, that already 3 to 10% of clients going to therapy in general will get worse. Okay. So what are some of the elements that you found in your literature review that makes therapy more effective and more beneficial and increasing well-being?
Yeah, it's interesting. This research it was started by Carl Rogers, looking at the difference that makes the difference, and the therapeutic alliance is the key. And now they're narrowing it down. Well, what about the therapy? How do you, what are the elements of a good therapist who's going to do that? And then, so the self-determination and autonomy, the support of that, the centering the values of the client, the agenda of the client, not your own agenda, so really respecting their boundaries. There are a lot of little things too that are considered important in creating that therapeutic alliance. And there are great measures out there for therapeutic alliance. In fact, the OQ45.2 has a TA, a therapeutic alliance version, where you can also measure that. And a lot of therapists use that and other measures to make sure that they're establishing that therapeutic alliance, because that even the therapeutic alliance in and of itself will influence change toward the client's goals.
Yeah, one of the things you mentioned in that conference was that 25% of poor results from therapy are associated with a lack of support for the client's self-determination.
Yeah, and I think that's the research that was done by the gay affirmative therapists on gay affirmative therapy. It's the Israel folks and what's the another group that did really looking at LGBT clients in particular, and they're particularly sensitive to being seen as a whole person, not making it all about their sexual attraction. It's really important to do that. And that's what I love about what the Breakthrough Clinic is doing. And
so you're telling me that clients didn't come into the office and you, Dr. Nicolosi, you didn't just go there and tell them what they should think about their sexual attractions and their behavior, and you impose something on them like this?
No, right. It's client-led. The client-led therapies are shown to be the most powerful. The client gets to pick what they want to work on. The client's in the driver's seat of their own therapy.
Exactly.
And that's what's most important. And so it's almost like a Montessori method of trauma treatment. What do you want to work on? Whatever that is, okay, let's explore it. Let's see what emotional dynamics are behind it. And then we integrate that with the trauma treatment. And so we're fusing that with the concept that it is client-led. I mean, the highest rated therapies are evidence-based, data-driven, and client-led. And we need this kind of robust research in order for the public to know which therapies meet these thresholds.
Okay. So that's the context that we already are doing this research in, and we're going to get the results what did we actually find? Dr. Pela, let's start with the risk of harm. What were the results that we found?
Yeah, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but what we found is a statistically significant increase in well-being. The instrument, the higher the number, the more distress that the client is experiencing. And so we had a statistically significant drop in distress. In fact, these men were at a level that we would find just a regular person on the street, we wouldn't expect for them to be in therapy. So, but when they left, they were ready to be finished with therapy. So they weren't at a clinic, they were well below the clinical level. When they started, they were above the clinical level of distress. The other thing that's interesting about this is there's a reliable change index for most instruments where and the reliable change index shows that if the client change is this number, in terms of points, number, like literally a number, and if it exceeds that, or it meets that or exceeds that difference, so their high to their low exceeds this difference, it means that it's a lasting and a reliable change. And so as an average, they exceeded that number. So we had reliable both a clinical and a statistical difference, and it's pretty. And you know what? I could see the raw data, right? So as it's coming in, I could see the raw data. That change happened very fast. Honestly.
Yeah, that's interesting. But before we get into it, let me just give a little data on the OQ45. It gives people a score from 0 to 180, and that's measuring well-being, or rather non-well-being, because the higher the number, the greater distress.
Right.
And so the cutoff would be 63. So if 63 and above would be clinical distress of some sort. Okay. Pre-test, I believe this is the data you gave us at the report, was the average or the mean was 71.27.
Yeah.
So there are a few deviations above that 63 there.
Right.
And the final post-test, which I believe was at 24 months, for about most of them was about 2 years, was 54.56. So below,
way below.
Yep, you had a nice wiggle room there. It was below the point of it being clinically significant, any distress they were experiencing.
Yeah, clinical distress. Yeah. Yeah. So it is pretty. And yeah, like I was saying, as I saw the data coming in, I could see that the reduction in distress it happened pretty soon. Now, of course, there's ebbs and flows, right? So as clinicians, you see that because this is hard work. I mean, trauma treatment's hard work. And so you're going to come in, and some days you're going to be pretty distressed, just because you're dealing. Yeah, you're dealing with stuff. But
and this is why I brought up about the loss of Joseph Nicolosi Sr. You lose someone you developed this attachment to, this very strong therapeutic alliance, and even with that potential barrier to the therapeutic process, you still see that decrease in distress at the very end. And when you say you're seeing the data come in, you're referring to the fact that we were testing this every 6 months.
Well,
so
actually, the therapeutic alliance was on a session-by-session basis. I was actually seeing all of that data.
So each session they're doing an OQ45.
Yeah, but I took the first and the last. For the research purposes, I took the first and the last, but I was tracking it as it's coming in, partially because we needed to do that. I mean, if there is, so ethically, as the principal investigator, I was responsible to make sure everybody's okay. So I needed to make sure that no one was being harmed. So I was getting that data, pretty frequently.
And you're saying that you were seeing that distress decrease pretty early on in treatment. Amazing.
Yeah.
What do we see as far as the results when it comes to the different dimensions of sexuality?
Yeah. So if we look at the sexual attraction fluidity, we were measuring attraction same-sex attraction, opposite-sex attraction, and sexual identity on all those levels that Dr. Nicolosi had mentioned earlier, all those areas. And so as a global measure, all of those, we saw fluidity in all of those. So the opposite-sex attractions increased statistically significantly. The same-sex attractions decreased statistically significantly, and then this sexual identity moved toward heterosexual.
Yeah,
statistically.
and actually, let me just jump in there real quick because we need to clear up some confusion. Dr. Nicolosi, when we're talking about on a continuum, what do they need clarification on? Most people are going to think that this sort of therapy is gay to straight, like a light switch, but what we're doing is working on more like a dimmer switch. Right. So can you explain what we're looking at as far as realistic outcomes when it comes to shifts in sexual attraction and identity and behavior?
Yeah, we're not. So the critique, I guess the far left or the far right would think about this in terms of flipping a light switch. Like they would say, you're trying to make gays straight and flip the switch and make them different. And there are some people who would have a misunderstanding about this therapy, that that's the goal, or that's it's not about flipping a light switch. It's about rotating a light dimmer. It's about gradual change of varying degrees. Every person's different. This is not a cookie cutter conveyor belt kind of approach. Each person is different. And so we want to look at what is a meaningful change for that person. And in terms of a research study, what's the overall effect as a group?
I want to make it very clear. People often accuse your dad of throwing this idea of a gay cure. And I never heard him ever say that and present his work as this is a cure for being gay, that this will change you radically, and that this is what you should expect as an outcome. Come see me, and after so many sessions, you'll be cured of your homosexuality. That was never how he promoted it or presented it. Mm-hmm. And right here, we see it. What you're doing has been consistent. It's not like this is a radical change with the work your father's doing. It's just, what I see is now it's more standardized, and you have greater control over who can identify as a reintegrative therapist. So you don't get these actual quacks or right around maligning the name. But it was never actually trying to promote this idea of at least to have this idea of a complete radical transformation or change from gay to straight.
Right. That's a good distinction you're making, Andrew. Now, if only big tech would let us talk about it, and so the public would know. So we'll see if this video gets banned, but that's a good point that the public needs to know. I mean, that's a part of the framework of the discussion itself. If we're going to have an understandable, useful, intellectual discussion, and we have to make the distinctions like the one you just made. And we'll see if this video stays up. Yeah.
Well, we'll see. Now, were there any other interesting findings, Dr. Pela, from the study? Any other results that stood out to you?
Well, just for me, I was curious because this was in a natural setting, and because some people finished their therapy earlier than others. We wanted to see if there were any relationships between the well-being that they came in with, the well-being that they left with, anything. And it was standard across the board, regardless of how distressed people were, when they came in, or how long they were in therapy. It was the same story. There was no correlation to any of that. So that was really interesting for me to see. That's just like a kind of a nerdy thing to be interested in.
That's actually the thing I was hoping you were going to bring up, because that did stand out to me as well in your report, that it really didn't matter the length of time of treatment, the benefits were the same. Now, there could be all sorts of factors about why some people needed longer than others. You can only speculate for some.
I mean, I don't never know. When somebody comes into me, sometimes they're, as a clinician, you never know how. I mean, from my perspective, sometimes I feel like people come in and they've already done a lot of work themselves internally, or there's something going on that they are ready and and then other people, as try as they might, they can't find the way through right away, you know, but that support, their well-being is influenced, and that's amazing to me. You know, we're talking about people. I just had to say this, as you were talking about earlier about this, what Joe Sr. was getting accused of and all of this. And if you've ever seen any of his, I'm sure you guys have seen his videos, but to the audience, if you ever seen his videos, the shame reduction that happens immediately, and his ability to do that was just artful. And
Yes.
and it's like, it's
The utter
you know,
irony of
yeah.
one of the other accusations we get is that we use shame in the counseling. We're shaming these clients, and yet the very purpose of this counseling is to reduce the shame. And so it always irks me.
I know. I know.
So much.
You can't get any more shame reducing than the work that you guys are doing.
I could tell story after story of clients. I just was telling Dr. Nicolosi the other week about a client who he just was telling me about how after one of our sessions, he broke down in tears because I was the first person in 27 years of his life that ever affirmed him as a man. I'm feeling it right now, just talking about all his life, never been told that you're a man and you're masculine. And just the joy he felt, but also the sadness to realize, wow, all my life I've never been told that. And you're telling me that we're shaming people? Like, give me a break. Like, I'm trying to keep it chilled as an interview, but I got fired up. Joe knows what I'm talking about. I was fired up about this because I see the attacks and the lies coming against the work we do, and it's just bogus. And the reality is we want the truth out there. If we were doing something harmful, we'd try to be all secretive. You know, we wouldn't want people to investigate. We're the ones who've been asking for more research. We're like, well, come on, let's find out. Is it really harmful? Is it effective? Come on, please study it with us. And the APA has been discouraging research because, well, encouraging research may increase the harm because they've already made the conclusion that it's harmful. So to conduct a study would be bad in and of itself.
You're drawing attention to how intrinsically anti-science and anti-intellectual APA's positions are, because now they're moving not just from discouraging research, they're taking positions that would result in full-blown elimination of all research into this field. They would actually make it illegal. And if the United States moves in the direction of Canada doing research on this topic, that could get you like prison time. I mean, this is not like, you know, George Orwell, 1984. This is not like Brave New World. This is actually happening. And so we're not just seeing the repression of clients' rights, but we're talking about more than stymieing research. It's a full elimination of research. And basically the message to clinicians and clients and the general public is you will not ask questions, and we will not answer your questions. You will think as we'll tell you to think. And this is part of a broader movement. You're not going to do this research. It starts with, you're not going to get this therapy. Then you're not going to read about it because, or listen to videos on it. We're going to shut that down. And then we'll make it by proxy of eliminating the therapy. You're by proxy eliminating the research. There's no possibility.
What are you going to research if it's all been banned?
How could Dr. Pela or any other researcher do this? Yeah, if the therapy's been banned. So it's a total elimination of the discussion. And it goes to show, I mean, what kind of a person, what kind of an individual would want to silence an argument? Only a person who themselves have a very weak argument. If you feel strong in your argument, you're fine with intellectual discussion. You know that no one can get a good education if they're only hearing one point of view on a topic, specifically a scientific topic. At the nexus point of sexuality and ethics and religion and culture, but to shape the discussion in such a way where individuals can only hear one side, it goes to show that the proponents of that approach probably know deep down they really don't have an argument. I mean, think about the hypocrisy to say that sexuality is fluid, but it can't be fluid toward heterosexuality. Think about the hypocrisy of saying that therapy is a powerful mechanism of change, but it can't be powerful when it comes to sexuality. That makes no sense. And as soon as the public sees that, they see how laughable this position is. So of course they have to shut down discussion. Otherwise people will see the truth.
Yeah, and this reminds me of in the 2009 APA Task Force report. It said we oppose SOCE, because that's what they're calling it there, because there are no training programs no ways of being trained in it. But we also discourage training in it. So it's like,
Right.
so we're not going to condemn it because there's no training you get, and you're not even allowed to do training in it.
There's a lack of definitive science, and we'd like to keep it that way.
Right.
Yes,
That's what they say.
exactly.
Amen. Yeah, that's it.
So this is a good segue to my next question, one of my last questions here. All right, Dr. Pela, when did you finish getting all the data?
Oh, golly. Do you remember?
I think it was like
Dr. Nicolosi?
2018, right?
That's probably about right. Yeah,
So-
that sounds about right.
And yet this study was not published until September 2021.
Yeah.
I remember when you were working on this, I kept asking you, hey, when's that study coming out? When's the
Oh,
study
I
coming out?
know. I know.
What was the process like submitting this to different journals? And
Yeah,
how many different
yeah.
journals did you have to submit this to?
I don't remember how many, honestly. I probably need some trauma therapy to be able to remember all of that, honestly. But okay, so I literally don't remember, but because some of them were it was more than one iteration, more than one submission to the same journal. So that's why it's hard for me to remember.
Okay, sure.
So, you know, so some of them, they got back with me and they're, you know, if you do this, 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 and this, and it was long list of what you need to do, and we will reconsider it. I'm like, okay, that's fair enough. It's a lot. But so we rewrote the article, resubmitted it. And then they're like, no, because your results, and the editor would get back with me. The journal editor would get back with me. So how this works is that you have reviewers, like usually about 3 to 4 reviewers who are blind reviewers. And they review it and they give you the comments. Well, and then you resubmit it, and you may be able to resubmit it more than once, but the editor got back with me on a couple of them and said, you know, your study is not, here, let me summarize. Your study's not perfect. And if I publish this study, and by the way, there is no perfect study.
Yeah.
And by the way, this is the most, you know, it's the most rigorous of
Anything
the
that's ever been done on this
genre,
topic.
right? Yeah. And it's certainly better than most of the crap that they publish. You know, I'm not saying it's perfect. Limitations are in there, you know, whatever. But anyway, and they're like, well, if I publish this, they don't want to be one of those editors that have to pull the article later on because someone gets mad because they say what you have, your results are different than the narrative.
Mm-hmm.
That's what they said. Your results are different than the narrative, and it would have to be perfect for me to publish it.
So you're telling me the scientific community doesn't want to just follow the science?
And this, no, and I say this isn't new. This isn't new. There's been pressure on all, it's not just this issue. It's just the way that it's a very political process.
Yeah.
It's not
Galileo. Back to Galileo, we've seen this.
Right. You know, people are not passionate for the truth at a level that overcomes the politics. And so for whatever reason, you know, it takes a lot of bravery for an editor to publish this. And so then, okay, so here's the funny thing is we'd rewrite the article, then we submit it somewhere else. The reviewers for that one would kind of reverse everything back to how we had it before. You know, but there's some, I mean, there was some good helpful information. Like I said, I cut out a part, you know, in my lit review. I'm very passionate about the lit review part, you know, and all the stuff that goes in the background of it because it hadn't been written about, it hadn't been all pulled together, and I wanted to do this. So I'm not saying that all the stuff that the reviewers said was not helpful. A lot of it was very helpful, you know, cleaning it up, concise. But in terms of the principles, the basic ideas, they wanted you to, do more, talk about this more, talk about this less, talk about, you know, talk about it. And then I realized after a while, I was like, oh, I get I could do this the rest of my life.
Mm.
And, and I was trying to get it into an APA journal. And then after that, a journal that was, a couple of journals that were very well read, highly indexed, high index.
Yeah, but an index, meaning we wanted to get into an index journal, meaning that's a journal that would show up in the databases. That if you're a college student or a university, you have these databases where you can look up articles and get them that way.
Well, I mean, a lot of them would, but the one that's well read, that's read a lot, even if it can be in a database and not be read a lot. So that's what I was looking for. And I had colleagues that were, and Dr. Nicolosi was there, that were encouraging us to hold off, keep submitting it. I'm like, my mental health says no. I always talked about it like gestating a baby, and that went way overdue, and I just needed to give birth. So
basically, just when it gets a narrative, just one journal after another or one editor after another, even with seeing the findings, like the findings are good, the research is good, just can't publish this.
I mean, they didn't come out and say it. They definitely didn't say it was good. I mean, none of them said that. They just said, it would have to be bulletproof for me to publish these results. The study would have, and so for example, the single group design, they would have had to have a control group. Well, I'm like, well, that ship has sailed, It is what it is. I mean, it's up to you.
They're nitpicking and find something. So eventually we publish it through the Journal of Human Sexuality, which is the journal of the Alliance for Therapeutic Choice and Scientific Integrity.
Right.
And Dr. Nicolosi, you really want to make sure this got into everyone's hands or before everyone's eyes. So what did you just say about the study when we were getting it published through there?
Yeah, I wanted it to be free to the public. And thankfully, the editor, Dr. Christopher Rossick, made it free to the public. And now anyone can get the paper in full, as it should be. I mean, that's really what scientific research really should be, in the spirit of the creation of the scientific community. It's ultimately so that we can have an open platform for the public and for everyone. And in that spirit, Dr. Rossick made it free to the public.
I really appreciate that, because oftentimes academia is like this ivory tower, and research is like whispered down the lane, because it takes like some newspaper to talk about some study that's published, but they just put their spin on it, and you can't get to the source material.
Right.
And here now you can actually go and look at the research yourself.
That's right.
So I really appreciate that.
Yeah. Me
so
too.
Last question for both of you guys. Dr. Pela, how should policymakers and decision makers use the research from the study?
Yeah, right. Well, they should be able to look at least the possibility that the study is showing that it's very possible for people to not be harmed, and that it's clear that some people's sexual attractions are fluid, if not everybody's sexual. I happen to believe that sexual attraction is a fluid thing, period. Like, we could all influence our sexual attractions. That's just how, it's weird that we couldn't do that. Like, that would be the only thing we can't influence in the human psychology is our sexual attractions. That's the one thing. You can influence your schizophrenia, but you can't your sexual, it's like bizarre. So, and for them to be able to use this and go, okay, I'm not saying this research says this. I'm standing on science, it's not, so don't shoot the messenger. I would love it if policymakers would get brave and, throw this stuff up there. And there's other studies, there are other studies. This isn't the only one that's giving evidence that people are helped.
Yes. Dr. Nicolosi, how should people use the research that's been published here?
People should interested parties should be able to know the research that's out there, and to know what options are available. And we are doing this in the spirit of APA Ethical Principle E. There are 5 different ethical principles, A, B, C, D, E. Ethical principle E is respect for clients' rights and dignity. And APA went further later on to describe the importance of self-determination, that was a part of ethical principle E. And what better way to support self-determination than to support clients in making their own therapy goals? And so that's something that all clinicians should be able to get on board with. And that's why even if a clinician is not necessarily working with people who are dealing with these issues about sexuality, it's an important reminder to all of us, this paper, at the spirit of ethical principle E, that clients should be able to pick their own therapy goals. And to Dr. Pela's point, there were many things that we thought couldn't change. We used to think that eye color couldn't change. We now see that for some individuals, their eye color does change. We used to think that fingerprints don't change. We were all told that in school. Your fingerprint is permanent. It'll never change. Now we're finding out actually for some people, their fingerprints subtly change. So there are so many different metrics, so many different things about ourselves that change. We used to think our DNA would never change. We were all taught that. Then we learned about epigenetics. Well, it's your DNA, but it's a part of your DNA and it interacts with the environment. And so there's nuance here. And so there are many components of us that are changing. And sexuality is one of them.
Yeah. Any closing remarks before we wrap up? Dr. Pela.
I think that folks can really see from this study that sexual attraction is fluid. And this, I would hope that people could start understanding that basic concept. Just the layperson could understand the basic concept that sexual attraction is fluid. It's normal for people to experience fluidity in their sexual attractions given certain circumstances, and that people can autonomously influence their sexual attractions who want to. The other thing to think about is that when you're seeing these therapy bans, they're not bans against any certain type of therapy. They're not. They're bans against this particular group of people, this sexual minority group setting their own therapeutic goals. They're bans against this one person. They're discriminating against these people, this little group of people. Why they want to beat up on this little group of people, I have my ideas, but that's what it is.
Yep.
That's
but in
what
reality,
it is. It's not about therapy.
Yep. In keeping with the ethical principles that Dr. Nicolosi was just mentioning, even pro-gay individuals should support clients' right to obtain this type of therapy.
Yeah.
Because when we get the facts and realize, okay, it's not actually harmful and it's not a waste of their time and resources, it actually is effective. When we understand efficacy on a continuum, then we ought to protect clients' rights to obtain this type of therapy. Any closing thoughts, Dr. Nicolosi?
The brain has the capacity to wire and rewire itself throughout the course of our life. And regions of the brain that are specifically related to sexual preference, like the hypothalamus and thalamus, are the same regions of the brain that we know change over the course of our life, and not just over the course of our life, but they change in response to our life experiences. And so it would make sense that sexuality can change for many people. There's fascinating information that's being suppressed by big tech and the mainstream media. You can go to reintegratithetherapy.com, click on science, and look at the many published studies that are out there. One fascinating one is with fMRI brain scans, looking at these regions of the brain and how the shifts in sexuality. One group of women who were bisexual, they had some heterosexual, some homosexual attractions. They practiced mindfulness meditation, and the same-sex attractions decreased, the opposite-sex attractions increased. That was non-volitional change. It was just through practicing mindfulness meditation. There are many other things out there. The implementation of bilateral eye movements has also been shown to have significant changes in individual sexuality. There's a whole world out there about the science of sexuality now, if only we were allowed to talk about it. So go to reintegratithetherapy.com, click on science, and there's a growing list of research studies, which I suspect over the next few years will continue to grow.
Yep. So follow the science, people. All right. And support. I hope for everyone else to look at this and just realize we need to rise up, speak up, and demand the evidence when it's seeing these policy decisions being made and just being told, well, here's the mantra. This is the motto. Born gay cannot change, and SOCE or conversion therapy is dangerous and harmful and it's been discredited. Demand to see the evidence. So I hope people will actually start to be a little more curious and question the narratives that have been out there. Maybe everything we've been hearing with all the misinformation and fake news stuff over the past couple of years, people are a little more skeptical, I pray, and will start demanding better research and more access to the research. Well, anyway, it's been a pleasure having you guys on. This was great. Thank you so much for your time, and have a good evening.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. It's good to see you guys.
I do. Bye, guys.